Chapter 2. Ethiopia's oldest daughter, Egypt. The Great Deception. Egypt, as pointed out before, was the northeastern region of ancient Ethiopia. The 6 cataracts of the Nile were the great watermarks in the heartland of the blacks from whence African culture spread over the continent. But nowhere was it as pronounced as in Egypt. This northern sector of the Ethiopian Empire had been the object of world attention from the earliest times. The fact was that it was in the center of the crossroads from all directions leading into Africa from Asia and Europe. This also explains how the Asians came to occupy and control a fourth of Egypt, Lower Egypt, before the unification of the two lands in the 3rd millennium BC. With the relentless spread of the desert and the attending scarcity of arable land, there was a heavier concentration of Africans in the Nile Delta and Valley, the areas with the richest soil in the empire. The great agricultural system that was developed along the overflowing Nile was one of the sources of the wealth to support the great cultural advances. The other was the gold mines below the first cataract. This was also the magnet that drew Caucasian peoples from many lands. As these increased in number and variety, the undermining of black power was accelerated. The melting pot of the races began around the northern perimeter. The end result was always the same. The blacks were pushed to the bottom of the social, economic, and political ladder whenever and wherever the Asians and their mulatto offsprings gained control. This scheme of weakening the blacks by turning their half-white brothers against them cannot be overemphasized because it began in the early times, became the universal practice of whites, and is still one of the cornerstones in the edifice of white power. The white Asians were generally very proud of their sons by black women, but these black mothers remained slaves, while their mulatto sons and daughters were born free and, moreover, classified as white. As such, they formed a social class that, while never recognized as equal with the real whites, had just about all the other privileges of free men. The picture was generally the same from about 4000 BC. Note: throughout this work, I refer to time spans of 6,000 years, 5,000 years, 4,000 years, 3,000, etc. The variations depend on the time span of the developments under discussion. End of note. In the Asian-held areas in the north, the blacks had hard choices to make. As elsewhere on the continent, they had the choice of remaining in their homeland and being reduced to the status of servants and slaves, or, if they were well-to-do members of the professional classes, architects, engineers, or skilled craftsmen, they could remain, become integrated in Asian society, be classed as white, and even hold high positions, or finally, they could reject integration into Asian culture and migrate southwards. This the great majority did. It is therefore not without significance that even today a number of African tribes 4,000 miles south from Egypt still claim it as their ancestral homeland. There were blacks who neither fled before the Asian advance nor submitted to enslavement, these also rejecting amalgamation as the process of transforming the race, stood their ground fighting back and were generally wiped out. In short, the Africans held Upper Egypt, south, while the Asiatics held Lower Egypt, north. Kurt Seethe, in attempting to reconstruct the prehistory of Egypt concluded that the division of the country between Africans in the south and Asiatics in the north was due mostly to a split over religion. According to this view, the Africans refused to accept the cult of Horus that dominated the Nile Delta. They therefore formed a second nation in Upper Egypt and established their national religious shrines at Amnos, Thebes, Thines, and Napata. Other scholars insist that the two lands meant that the Africans had simply separated themselves from the Asians. These, unlike Sethi, do not inquire about the reasons. What actually happened in prehistoric times, however, was on such a grand scale over long periods of time that patterns, even of unwritten history, became clear and understandable. The Asians and Europeans were entering in increasing numbers and pushing the Africans farther and farther away from the Mediterranean, pushing them farther and farther towards what became Africa south of the Sahara. But the Africans had taken their first firm stand within their Egypt, making it two lands, exactly as the Sudan is two lands today, with the Arabs and colored Arabs in the north and Africans in the south, and also for exactly the same reason, to escape white oppression. And the Sudanese blacks concentrated in the south for the same ancient reason, to escape white and colored oppression. We are in the period of ancient history. The records of the times are unmistakable, and the evidence is clear only when the archaeologists have done their work as well. In no area of the world have they been more successful than in Egypt. It was the science of archaeology, along with ancient historical records, that support my viewpoint that the Africans, while being either subjugated or pushed southwards, fought back in a long series of wars to regain their ancient homeland along the Mediterranean. As early as the end of the 4th millennium BC, and even before the first dynasty in Egypt, there are records of a great African victory over the Asians in the north. Note: reference is made to the pellets and mace heads found at Hyrcanopolis. End of note. The blacks had established their Egyptian capital at Nekheb. The royal palace was just across the river at Nekheb. Thebes and Napata continued to be the cultural centers of the black world. As the historic period opened in Egypt, it appeared that the Africans were retaking the whole of their country. The Palermo stone records victory after victory over the Asians. Finally, the great triumph came when the African king Menes defeated the Asians decisively, united all Egypt under African rule again, and thus became the historic First Dynasty. Note: there was in fact no Egypt before Menes built Memphis. End of note. Historians of ancient Egypt would do well to pause and ponder longer over the question of the two lands. Those who are interested in the truth about the black man's history will be compelled to do so. For the most significant part of the black African's history developed in Egypt, and the division of the country into two lands, one predominantly Asian and the other African, marked the first great stage of the unending process and pressures that steadily forced the blacks from the northern areas. But for countless centuries, the greater region was held by the blacks. This was the southern region called Upper Egypt. It seems quite clear that the seesaw conflict between Africans and Asians covered centuries back into prehistory, just as it was to continue intermittently for nearly 5,000 years after Menes. Indeed, the Zanzibar Revolution and the purely racial conflict in the Sudan are simply a present-day continuity of the ancient struggle between the invaders and the invaded. After the Asian North was subdued, the African capital city was moved from Nekeb in the south to the north, where the two lands met. Here, astride what had been the boundary, the eternal city of Memphis was built, named for the king, and like Thebes, became the focal point of black power and one of the chief centers of African civilization. In completing the building of Memphis, Menes' nephew apparently believed that he was making the final settlement of the Asian problem, and that this capital city would stand forever. The massive fortification system built to control the Asians stood for centuries. The Africans' literal belief in immortality was reflected in their building and burial arrangements. The early three-chambered brick mastabas foreshadowed the later pyramids that were to surround the city like watchmen and form a line of march from there into the Giza Desert. During one of the longest reigns in history, Menes brought about the kind of stability and innovations in administration that not only provided a solid foundation for a first dynasty, but also the economic and social conditions necessary for the more uniform expansion of religion, the arts, crafts, and the mathematical sciences. Here too is where Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Greece, although not as advanced, may have made cultural contributions to the Africans and received much from them in return. The external influence myth. The Greek contribution was the greatest. It was accidental, one of those accidents of history that turns out to be highly important. In this case, the Greeks unwittingly applied the second name of the city of Menes, Memphis, Aegyptos, to the whole country. For Memphis was also called Hecupta, or the mansion of the south of Ptah, the god protector of the city. From the Greek Aegyptos, Memphis became Egypt, and Egypt became the name of the two lands, extending from the Mediterranean to the first cataract. There was no Egypt before the black king from whose name it was indirectly derived. Before that, the country was called Kem, or Kemai, another name indicating its black inhabitants, and not the color of the soil, as some writers have needlessly strained themselves in asserting. Indeed, the strong predilection of both Europeans and white Asians to replace the names of other peoples and places with their own terminologies was at once a blessing and a curse in the history of the blacks. Not knowing the racist twist that modern history was to take, these early historians, geographers, and travelers reported what they found and described peoples in their own terms of speech. In doing so, they established beyond question that the blacks were the first Egyptians and the builders of that ancient civilization. For it was these early writers, and not the blacks, who made it clear that although the invading Euro-Asians had firmly established themselves in about 1/4 of northern Ethiopia, Lower Egypt, as early as the 4th millennium BC, The blacks, with equal firmness, held all the rest from the 29th north parallel to the 10th south. It was the whites, not the blacks, who called Africa the land of the blacks, until Asian and European invasions made it expedient to change this to mean African countries not yet taken over by Caucasians, and later to Africa south of the Sahara. Even this has to be qualified now, as the whites dominate southern African and Portuguese-held areas. The early whites, again, not the blacks, not only defined all Upper Egypt as black to distinguish it from predominantly white Lower Egypt, but they settled the matter for posterity by calling Upper Egypt the Thebaid, and the blacks Thebans, because Thebes, no way, was the oldest and greatest center of black civilization. The curse referred to above concerns the amazing success of modern writers in so blotting out, obscuring, or reinterpreting the earlier writers on Africa that the actual role of the blacks in their own land was practically erased from memory. Their strategy of silence worked, and must have worked more successfully than they could have dreamed. The great silence even fell over the monumental fact that the blacks themselves started the whole dynastic system in Egypt about 3100 BC, and that the great civilization of world acclaim developed after these black regimes began. Greek and Arabic names and the accepted Caucasoid features in the conventional style of royal portraits all furthered the great deception. There was also the external influence on early African speech and writing in Egypt. As more and more Asians moved into Upper Egypt after the unification of the two lands, the mingling of the two peoples not only produced a new breed of Egyptians, but also an increasingly Afro-Asian language and writing system that differed markedly from the original African writing as it was developed below the first cataract. Development in Asia and Europe, 1,000 and 2,000 years after the golden age of black civilization, helped to obscure that civilization or paint it over as an entirely Euro-Asian achievement. Our task is to begin the removal of this false incrustation, hardened as it is by 2,000 years of unchallenged growth. The time and continuum in the history of the blacks is highly important in reference to the state of civilization in the lands from which the invading groups came during the first 1,000 years of black ascendancy in Egypt and southern Ethiopia, the Sudan. The record is quite clear that the incursive groups were largely tent-dwelling nomads. They had no tradition of great cities with imposing temples, obelisks, pyramids, or indeed stonemasonry at all. In particular, one should note the number of centuries after Thebes and Memphis before their ancient cities were founded. Norway, Thebes, prehistory. Memphis, 3100. Rome, village, 1000 BC. Rome, town, 250 BC. Athens, village, 1200 BC. Athens, city, 360 BC. Antioch, 400 BC. Jerusalem, 1400 BC. Babylon, 2100 BC. In short, what great contributions did these roaming nomads have to make to an already highly developed black civilization? Since even Jerusalem was not in existence, what people in Lower Egypt came from a country with a city as great as Thebes or Memphis? It was the beginning of a new era in the history of the blacks, when an Ethiopian king turned the course of the Nile River by building a great dam at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt for the site of the new capital that was to bear his name. For generations, Memphis was almost entirely an all-African city, with white Asian villages slowly growing up around the outskirts. For the Asians are a very smart and very cunning people. Once conquered, they feigned complete and humble acceptance of African rule. Far from showing the slightest signs of any feeling of racial superiority, they were such masters of the art of dissembling that they could hoodwink the Africans, often under the guise of brotherhood, by capitalizing on their often dark complexions, similar institutions, intermarriages, and mixing with the black population generally as far as possible. That all this was the direct route to repeated Asian ascendancy on the continent, few Africans seem to see, for they are, as a race, too ready to forgive and forget past evils committed by foreigners. Whereas, on the other hand, a fellow African tribe can easily become a traditional enemy, and continue as such for so many generations that no one remembers what the original quarrel was all about. So the blacks were apparently unconcerned about the Asian villages springing up just outside of Memphis, nor about the largest one that was more rapidly developing just across the river on the right bank. This community was to become the Asian city of Fostat that challenged the supremacy of the capital city and eventually helped to change its African character and cause its final destruction. Yet, what I have just stated so briefly occurred only after nearly 3,000 years of glorious history. It remained the capital and one of the greatest cities of Egypt and the world from the 1st to the 20th dynasty, when it yielded to Thebes again. But it was still a great city when Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BC. Its death knell was sounded only when Arab tribes overran the land and Cairo rose to overshadow it. The 2nd and 3rd dynasties were also African. Most writers will not flatly state this. They generally designate these dynasties as Thinite, Memphite, or followers of Seth. One has to know that the 1st dynasty was African and Memphite, or Thinite, so called after the name of their sacred city, Thinis, and that the cults of Seth and Ammon were African. That the 4th dynasty was indigenous is equally clear. These were the chief pyramid builders, the Great Pyramid being the largest and highest building on earth until modern times. It was built during the reign of Khufu, 2590 to 67 BC. His nephew Khafre carried on and built the 2nd Great Pyramid, but he went farther. He built the Great Sphinx, and as though he intended to settle the question of his racial identity for all ages to come, He had his African features so boldly and clearly carved into a portrait statue that not even a fool could seriously doubt that this mighty monarch was a Negro. He was therefore among the first to break with the classical Caucasoid stereotypes in Egyptian portraits. Having determined what periods Africans were referred to as Thynites, Memphistes, Thebans, Cushites, Libyans, Ethiopians, Nubians, etc., a major problem in African history was near solution. Some of the disguising masks were thus removed, but much still remained to be done in developing guidelines to identification, because the work of effacing the black man's role in world history was so thoroughly done over so many centuries that it is amazing how so universal a consensus was reached by Caucasian writers in almost every age. Yet it should have occurred to some that, since they themselves knew very well who the black civilization builders were, painstaking research would later reveal all they tried to conceal. I point out repeatedly also that some of the bias is not deliberate, but often so deeply rooted that the white scholar is totally unaware of it. One of these, for example, was Sir Flinders W.M. Petrie, one of the greatest archaeologist historians of Egypt. He tried so hard to be scientifically objective, yet when he unearthed a famous king or queen who was unmistakably Negro, he seemed to be quite puzzled. But like most of his fellow investigators, some of his best thinking was set in motion for a rational explanation. Thus, the find of Sneferu's black queen, Mertetefs, indicated that the royal wife might be of an inferior race and not of the high type. But the guidelines I found useful in identifying who was who are: 1. Knowing the terms used when referring to early Africans. 2. Noting rulers whom the writers concede to be Africans or persons with marked Negroid features, and tracing this line to succeeding dynasties, i.e. 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. 3. Noting what kings or queens in later dynasties claimed an African ruler of an early period as their ancestor, and accordingly venerated and worshipped. 4. Similarly, what kings and queens take the name of ancient black rulers and build temples and monuments to perpetuate their memory. 5. The evidence in stone, inscriptions on monuments, and stelae of various kinds. 6. To what race did the invading rulers from the south belong, and over what kind of people did they rule below the first cataract? 7. And finally, the unearthed statues and portraits of kings and queens of Egypt who were pure Africans, unless physical anthropologists now wish to change their criteria for determining race. There are a few guidelines to early Egyptians as early black Africans. The fact of black rulers, however, is not as important as the fact of an indigenous black population from which they sprang, for these early blacks were themselves a great people, excelling on many fronts from a line of builders so distant in the past that it seems to have extended into the Stone Ages. It was a society of scientists, scholars, organized religions with organized priesthoods, mathematicians, scribes, architects, engineers, standing armies and generals, stone and brick masons, carpenters, artists, sculptors, cloth makers, slaves, farmers, teachers, gold and silversmiths, blacksmiths, and so on the widest spectrum of an advanced society. Africa, as the cradle of civilization, meant exactly that. These blacks developed one of the oldest written languages. The Egyptian language was an African language with later Asiatic influence, similar to that of Arabic on the African language known as Swahili. And it was as totally destroyed and replaced by a non-indigenous tongue as were other African creations. Nothing better marked the increasing cleavage between the blacks and their half-brothers beyond the cataracts than this linguistic nationalism, the refusal of the retreating blacks to use the Asianized Egyptian tongue. The mulatto problem. The recent revival of Black is Beautiful is no more than that, a revival. The great majority of ancient blacks took great pride in their color, and their resistance to amalgamation may be so interpreted. For one thing they had observed in Egypt was that a dynasty, beginning as all black, could remain unbroken over generations and still in the end become near white in color with not a black face in the royal lineage. This two-way process of intermingling and direct aggression meant victory for the white Asians in the end. They were already within the country as Egyptians when the conquering hordes from their various homelands swept in. Many were nationalistic Egyptians, and as such fought the invaders along with the Africans. Others, though born in Egypt also, were loyal to their fathers' native countries and sided with their armies. Since the first to be called Egyptians exclusively were half African and half Asian, their general hostility to their mother's race was a social phenomenon that should not be passed over lightly, even though that development followed a universal pattern and therefore was not peculiar to the Egyptians. Its nature is essentially opportunist, a quest for security, recognition, and advancement by identifying with and becoming a part of the new power elite of the conquerors. The invading conquerors not only capture and control all political and economic power by military might, but even though they might be nomadic barbarians, they generally claim to be from a higher civilization and therefore reinforce the myth of being superior, in fact, and not just because of military conquest. Even if no such claim is made, the new ruling classes and all members of their race are superior vis-a-vis the indigenous or conquered people. Expediency and survival itself dictated loyalty and faithful service to the Asian masters in the regions over which they had gained control, first in northern Egypt. This meant that even in the beginning, siding with the Asians was not solely determined by whether one was a half-breed or a full-blooded African. Blacks who did not choose to flee south but remained under Asian rule, even if enslaved, worked harder to gain recognition and acceptance than any other group. Indeed, so anxious were some of these early blacks for integration with the Asians that they themselves did most in creating the new breed of Egyptians, who were to become their mortal enemies. For in an all-out effort to appease the invaders, they freely gave their daughters and other desirable females as gifts to become concubines, thus speeding up the reproduction processes on an ever-widening scale. Nor did this lessen the wholesale capture of women enraged on African villages for the same purpose and for export to Asia. Reference was made to the Egyptians' race of their mothers, for in Egypt, as elsewhere, it was a one-way sexual process. The master race always kept its own women sacred and secluded behind the walls of their homes. They were not allowed to go outside except under guard. African women had no such restrictions or protection. They were fair game for the men of all races, and for them it was always open season. Many black women preferred death by suicide. Of these, 2 history does not sing. The master race, then, while loudly proclaiming a strange doctrine of racial purity for itself, has been the world's leader in bastardizing other peoples. So it has been on a grand scale in the United States, in South America, in East and South Africa, and so it was in Egypt. The evolution of the Egyptians as a nationality group is as interesting as their anti-African attitude, although the latter differs not at all from that of many mixed breeds with African blood elsewhere. It has been stated that the original Egyptians were black, half African and half Asian. This general racial pattern changed, however, as the centuries passed along and more white conquerors, their followers, and the other whites were attracted to the breadbasket on the Nile. Canaanites, Jews, Syrians, Hittites, Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Turks, Arabs, Romans, et al. Intermarriages between conquerors and conquered continued, along with concubinage as a national institution. The direct result was that more and more Egyptians became lighter and near white in complexion. In short, they did in fact become more Asian in blood than African. Yet this upper ruling class of near whites was at no time more than 1/4 of the population, for until the Islamic flood, which began in the middle of the 7th century AD, the vast majority of the Egyptians were what modern scholars like to characterize as Negroid. Note, the unmixed blacks in Egypt I am still designating as African. The mulattoes, then as now, generally objected to being called Africans. End of note. But what has been referred to as a social phenomenon was in fact a development among the half-breeds everywhere that ran counter to what would be normally expected, if not contrary to nature itself. This was the outright rejection of one's mother and her people, and a cleaving to the father and his people. While I do not know whether the overwhelming love which Africans generally have for their mothers is any greater than that among other peoples, it is certainly so marked that it has been a matter of comment by many writers. Some of the principal reasons why the half-breeds turned against the blacks and sought integration with the Asians have been pointed out. These applied to the blacks as well as to the new breed. All sought security, advancement, and social prestige by ingratiating themselves with the current ruling classes. But the half-breeds had the inside track and all of the advantages. First of all, they were mainly the sons and daughters of white and European Asian fathers. These fathers recognized them as such and, in general, proudly. And since they claimed superiority over the Africans, their half-African offsprings considered themselves to be a superior breed also. These Afro-Asian offsprings were given preferential treatment, positions of authority, wealth according to the status of their patrilineal family, and an education that could draw on Asian culture as well as the highly advanced African civilization in Upper Egypt and southwards to the land of the gods. Another situation that was a most potent factor in the half-breeds' attitude toward their mother's race was that more often than not, their mothers were concubinary slaves. This meant that the half-breed was introduced into the lowest level of African life, even from birth. Concubinage was so general that it overshadowed the small number of African women who were the legitimate wives of Asians. These African wives were the exception, generally coming as they did from powerful upper classes, the noble or royal families. In such cases, it did not seem to matter at all how black they were. But since most of the new Egyptians were originally sons and daughters of slave mothers and upper-class fathers, they tended to be ashamed of their mothers and sought self-realization on their father's side. Furthermore, the slave mother had no claim on the children she bore. They belonged to the Asian father, who could and generally did consider them as freeborn due to their Asian blood. To prove how truly Asian they were, the mixed Egyptians made hatred of Africans a ritual, and tried to surpass the whites in raiding for slaves in all African areas. Various Afro-Eurasians who became Egyptian kings declared eternal warfare against the blacks and vowed to enslave the entire race. Hope in this connection could have developed from the fact that while many races were represented among captured slaves, the Africans constituted the largest number. Relying wholly on the emerging concept of innate superiority of Europeans and Asians, these people everywhere created a class system that made their bastard offsprings superior to all blacks, and in status next below themselves. The system operated in the 20th century the same as it did in earlier times. The Afro-Dutch coloreds of South Africa fully illustrate most of the points made about Egyptians. The coloreds' hatred of Africans seemed to be even more thoroughgoing than that of the whites in South Africa. Because of their Dutch blood, they too had been given special privileges, a higher social and economic status than the blacks, and a completely separate society. Education and civil rights denied the blacks were theirs. The best available jobs for non-whites were theirs. But above all, they had the magic of the half-white skin that in itself automatically put them above the blacks. Some of these coloreds became hysterical if reminded of their Bantu or Kafir blood. The lightest ones simply deny having any African blood. Yet sometimes nature itself, as though disgusted with these ridiculous pretensions, plays a joke on some of the very lightest husbands and wives by presenting them with a black baby, a throwback from black ancestors. The most charitable thing that can be said about the racism of the Dutch Boers and their cape-colored offsprings is that they were ignorant of even the names of great African leaders, not to mention the great civilization they had built just north of where the Dutch first landed. But the Assyrians, Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans could make no such claim to support the myth of Caucasian superiority, for nothing seems clearer from ancient records than that the whole ancient world knew of nothing more ancient than the black man's civilization. The real challenge was standing there in monuments of stone which the blacks had built on a scale that had withstood all passing ages. To meet this challenge, the Asians and their Afro-Asian offsprings set about to do three main things. 1. To destroy everything left by the Africans that indicated African superiority. 2. But where the temples, monuments, etc. were of such beauty and durability that destruction was less desirable than claiming the achievements as their own, in these cases African inscriptions were systematically erased and replaced with Asian and new Egyptian inscriptions that gave to themselves the credit for whatever achievements there were. Sometimes the inscriptions were so deeply engraved that effacement was impossible, so the workmen would have to conceal these by building stone casings around them. The early African builders had been most exasperating, leaving their statues everywhere, flat noses, thick lips and all. Hundreds of statuettes were carved in various dynasties. These could be thrown away, but what to do with the huge monumental statues that were lined up outside of the most famous temples? The problem was solved by passing those Egyptian rulers who merely had Negroid features. Many of those with all African faces simply had their heads knocked off, all to no lasting avail. The facts of history could not be completely changed. One troublesome fact was that most of the greatest kings and queens of Egypt were black Africans, so great indeed that their names were gladly spread over pages that glorified the Egyptian past. Their names, but not their African identity. In history, these blacks are simply Egyptians, and not Cushites, Ethiopians, or Nubians. This is still another technique for deliberately losing track of African history. But the archaeologists' spades just kept turning up statuettes and some remarkable portraits that frustrate some scholars, while others feel challenged and reply with a heavy artillery of misleading words and phrases. Regardless of what the field investigators find, the main work of reconstructing African history in the 20th century is still in the hands of those who degraded it. White hands who still have the power to shape it as they will. 3. Finally, the great revolt of white slaves, Mamelukes, in 1250 A.D., and their murderous onslaughts against their Turk and Arab masters ended forever the general enslavement of whites, and thereafter led to a concentration on the enslavement of blacks only. This changed the course of history and came to make the myth of racial superiority, inferiority appear to be a visible reality. Master and slave. Could there be any question about it? Even the slaves could realize that their actual situation was one of inferiority, and after centuries of bondage, the slaves generally came to believe that they were in fact inferior beings, and that their masters, by the very arrangements of life, were superior. For whether in Asia, Europe, South America, the United States, or the West Indies, the story was the same. The essential links with their past were broken. All knowledge of former greatness was lost. Even their kinship and family relationships were destroyed along with their true names. They were not regarded as human beings. They became a race of outcasts, hating themselves for being. The Caucasian triumph was complete. In the course of time, the Egyptians became more and more conscious of their separate national and non-Asian identity as Egyptians. The term Asian, of course, covered numerous white nationality and ethnic groups. Asian blood had no specific meaning. It might be Hebrew, Mongolian, Arabic, Persian, Indian, and so on. Egyptian nationalism, with its sense of independence, could evolve all the more easily because of this lack of exclusive identity with any one of their kindred nationalities. Another important factor was the relatively unmixed Asians and a sprinkling of Europeans who had been living in the country for so many generations that they regarded themselves as Egyptians, owing no loyalty to their native lands and ready to fight as Egyptians when Egypt was attacked or herself went to war. Here again, we see additional reasons why the Egyptians felt more Asian than African. They become even clearer if we keep in mind that during all the centuries of Egyptian evolution to a separate identity and nationhood, relentless warfare with the Africans continued. As long as the Africans seemed resolved to retake Egypt, no pharaoh could rest easily. From the record, extending over several thousand years, it seems that the blacks intended to reconquer Egypt as Menes had done or fight on forever. They seemed to take their most devastating defeats as mere temporary setbacks and always invaded or attempted to invade Egypt again and again. And again, note the very different Western version. Is this one of the principal reasons the Egyptians hated them so much? Was the mass enslavement of Africans a part of a scheme to break the power and end the eternal threat from the now southern land of the blacks? I am, of course, fully aware that the same ancient records may be read and interpreted in such a way that one would think that most of the invasions were one way from Egypt into the all-black countries below the First Cataract, and that, indeed, the Africans were no match for the mighty Egyptian armies, but generally turned tail and fled. In this, and 100 other instances, I simply read the record differently. The great chain of defense fortifications the Egyptians built facing south at the First Cataract were hardly built to prevent themselves from invading the Black Empire. As late as the 12th dynasty, records still refer to wars against the Asian invaders and to defense measures such as building walls on the eastern frontier. They had been expelled en masse from the rich Delta region in 2040 BC. Note, this is the generally accepted view. I note elsewhere that it was not a mass expulsion of Asians. End of note. But they always returned, if not as conquering warriors, then as peaceful traders or friendly migrants seeking a home. It should also be remembered that Egypt was not always the innocent object of aggression, but was herself often the invading aggressor in Asia. She also enslaved many Asians and marched them back to Egypt, men, women, and children. It can be said with certainty, therefore, that some of the many invasions of Egypt were invited or provoked by Egypt's own imperialistic adventures. Yet, they may well have been countermoves to check the constant invasions from these regions. The African masses courted from all directions as their own leaders progressively became Caucasian, Hamites, and Semites, and as many who were unmistakably full-blooded Africans became as predatory as were their known enemies. Note: one lesson of history is quite clear. One's own leaders may be as unjust, inhuman, and as brutal as strangers, often more so. End of note. It appears that from times immemorial, stark greed, the desire for wealth, has overridden all humane considerations. Greed has served as a kind of anesthesia, deadening humane sentiments and breaking the bonds of affection that relates man to man. Greed was triumphant in Egypt from ancient times down into our own century. It was the major slave exchange center in Africa. Nubia, the northern Sudan, was not only the chief source of supply for slaves who were marched up to the Second Cataract, but it was also the main source of gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, precious stones of many kinds, ebony, and animal skins. These enriched Egypt in her expanding international trade. A hostile Egypt now stood between the black world and international commerce. But all had not been going well in the land. There had been civil wars, division of the country again, reunification again, decentralization, a breakup into autonomous nomarchies, and back to unification once more. These ups and downs seemed to be according to the strength or weakness of the leadership in any given period, or the role played by the conquerors in unifying or failing to unify the country. Black Egypt turning brown and white. The long stretch of the centuries into millenniums made it easy to delete some of the most significant developments in those early ages in Egypt. The emergence of great leaders and long periods of remarkable achievements were followed by weak leaders and long periods of national disorganization and chaos in such amazing cycles that it seems that some relentless socio-political law was operating in the land. Centralized government, first instituted by Menes, always collapsed as civil war spread over the provinces and constituent kingdoms. One of the worst and most fateful periods of crisis was during the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties, 2181 to 2040 BC. What happened during this period of political anarchy is typical of the unproclaimed processes that slowly but steadily changed both the political and ethnic character of Egypt and, in the end, that of the all-black Sudan as well. During this period, as in many others, the blacks played a leading role in expediting their own downfall, a fact as important in their history as anything else. In Egypt, it was an almost endless power struggle, both within the royal lineages on the national and provincial levels, and between the various provinces. The civil strife became more intense and bitter as the largest and strongest provinces, such as Thebes, tried to force the others back into a state of national unity. The trouble was that too many nomarchs, chiefs, were trying to do the same thing, each being ambitious to become the pharaoh of all Egypt at the very least, and all Ethiopia if possible, Egypt and the Sudan. Held in the center of the empire, Upper Egypt, for 141 years. 141 years of retrogression and destruction. Both ends of the empire broke away from the center. The northern end, white Lower Egypt, became independent again, and more white spread over Upper Egypt, taking full advantage of the general upheaval and promoting it by forming alliances with various provincial chiefs in the warfare against others. Since Lower Egypt also had internal strife among its now independent provinces, Delta chiefs did not hesitate in accepting the invitations of black princes to form alliances and lead troops into Upper Egypt. Asians also marched across the desert from Libya, where they had also replaced the indigenous blacks and were now the dominant population. The steady transformation from black to brown to white becomes even clearer if it is remembered that after the unification of the two lands, the whites of Lower Egypt had every legal right to travel and settle in black Upper Egypt. And while there was always a general opposition, there had been a steady infiltration from the beginning. They, like their Libyan kinsmen, always came in a manner that never caused immediate harm. Small numbers spreading out, and then gradually forming separate communities next to an African village, town, or city. They became an integral part of life in the provinces, became the active supporters of the local chiefs, nomarchs, married into their families, and, by so doing, in time became legitimate chiefs themselves. The Asian power base was thus firmly established in provinces, and established so slowly without fanfare that it appeared to be an imperceptible development. The same changes had been taking place on the national level in some of the royal families. But the biggest changes in the racial character of Egypt always occurred during the crisis periods of political decentralization and civil disorder, when the whites came in hordes and spread over the country. The already established Asian communities served as magnets, but the overflow of settlers caused the building of numerous new communities. They could now move in unchallenged. They came in not only from the Delta and Libya, but from Asia also. These were not military invasions, but invading settlers. They were, like John the Baptist, the forerunners. They prepared the way and made it easy for all the invading armies that came later from Asia and Europe. These could now count on cooperation and welcome from the white population already in Egypt. A century and a half of this, a pause and reflection are required here if the full significance of what has been set forth above is to be grasped. Yet the picture need not be as confusing as many writers have made it by the simple expedient of omitting salient facts. Among these are the following. 1. The collapse of centralized authority from Memphis not only enabled Lower Egypt to become independent again, but it also meant that this predominantly Asian region was in the same state of disruption as the rest of the country. 2. Kings in Lower Egypt, ruling from Avaris or Sais, often claimed to be kings or pharaohs of all Egypt without having gained control of the whole country. Just as kings in Upper Egypt, ruling from Thebes or Memphis, made similar claims during the same period without having gained control over the whole country or even all of Upper Egypt. This point is highly important, for what it means is that there were periods when both white and black aspirants claimed to be pharaohs of Egypt at the same time, when none actually had effective control over the nation. 3. Writers, knowing this well enough, have nevertheless generally presented the whites and Afro-Asians, classified as white, as the Egyptian pharaohs, while ignoring the African pharaohs altogether. Their defense, when pressed, is that the African pharaohs are indicated as Thebians, Memphites, etc., satisfied, as previously pointed out, that the use of these terms is a part of the blackout of black history. 4. The periods during which the Asian incursions were greatest, such as 2181 to 2040 BC, should be stressed. because these population pressures caused a steady withdrawal of non-integrating blacks southward below the First Cataract. 5. To overlook this early separatist movement among the blacks is to neglect one of the most important keys to the fuller understanding of black Egyptian history. But just as the blacks had withdrawn in large numbers from Lower Egypt as it became more and more white and began to settle beyond what became the border between Lower and Upper Egypt, so now they had been moving from place to place in Upper Egypt in a futile effort to escape from the ever-pressing whites. These were the blacks who finally joined others in the south, Nubia. Nubia, therefore, revolted and became independent during the same period of general collapse at the center. But the compelling reasons, as stated elsewhere, appear to have been resistance not only to the increasing Asian power in Upper Egypt, but also to the African and Afro-Asian pharaohs whose integration policies promoted the spread of this foreign power in what had been an important region of their homeland. It was black separatism and racialism without apology. It was even something more than a resistance movement against the political domination of foreigners and the social degradation of the blacks that always followed. But it was a stubborn resistance to the extinction of the race itself through amalgamation. These were the first of the race for whom black was in fact beautiful, and not just a catching slogan of the day. The expansion of white power from the Delta into Upper Egypt had been going on slowly long before the age of weak kings. They had been appointed as ministers, court officials of various kinds, trade commissioners, army officers, and soldiers. The 90-year reign of Pepi II, the longest in history, was in their favor. For while Pepi had been a strong leader and a mighty king during the first 50 years of his reign, the general upheaval began when he had become too old to govern or even know what was going on in the country. This unheard of long reign made the 6th dynasty the introduction to the era of chaos. This was the period of simultaneous dynasties of Asian, Libyans, and Theban pharaohs, and several different capitals. There were so many kings during the 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties with very short reigns that many of their names are unknown. Finally, the line of African kings ruling from Thebes first overcame the other powerful Asian dynasty in Upper Egypt that was centered at Heracleopolis, and proceeded with the awful task of uniting the empire again. Strong rulers had begun to emerge again in 2133. So, the 11th dynasty of the great Mentuhoteps began 93 years before the 10th dynasty ended. A further illustration of points previously made. Mentuhotep II was probably the greatest of 11th dynasty kings. It was he who undertook to settle the white Asian problem forever by reversing the policy of integration and expelling them from Lower Egypt. Historians of the period write that he did expel the Asians from the Delta in 2040 BC. This too is misleading, for while he did indeed reconquer Lower Egypt again, and probably believed that reunification with the Black South would be easier if he first drove the Asians out, he was now 1,000 years too late for such a task. The Asians could not be expelled en masse in any event, for all Lower Egypt was overwhelmingly an Asian population and had been so far for centuries beyond record. Nobody knows at what point in time they became the dominant people there. What Mentuhotep did was to put the government to flight, along with its army and other known supporters. Besides, the agents were now dispersed all through the provinces of Upper Egypt. The compelling reason for the reconquest of the Delta was always economic. In fact, race itself was an economic factor. When agents controlled, it was a commercial blockade of the blacks from direct world trade and international relations in general. Therefore, the second reunification in 2040 ushered in another golden age in black history. African ships of commerce sailed the seas again. Nationwide reconstruction was pushed, and the revival of learning, science, the arts, and crafts marked the 11th and 12th dynasties. The most important lesson the black world can learn from its history is that there was an economic development base for each and every advance. Meanwhile, the blacks concentrated in the South had firmly fixed the dividing line between themselves and their brothers in Upper Egypt at the First Cataract. This too meant war, because the South was the richest region in mineral resources. The long war against Nubia began during the 11th dynasty and went on year after year without success. A very real problem now was the attitude of the black troops from Thebes toward a war against their brothers in the South. In any event, no progress in overcoming the South was made at all until the power center at Thebes was moved to Al-Fayoum in the 12th dynasty. Even then, the war dragged on for another 50 years before the region bordering on Egypt, called Lower Nubia, was brought under control. Henceforth, the country from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean was definitely called Egypt, and the country from the First Cataract southward was definitely called Ethiopia, Nubia, Kush, etc. The end of the 12th dynasty in 1786 ended nearly 3½ centuries of great leaders and, therefore, great progress. Yet, once again, the cycle of disaster returned with the 13th dynasty. Mental pygmies sat on the thrones, once occupied by giants. Nearly 2 centuries of internal strife and decay followed. Lower Egypt, of course, had quickly become independent again, for the 3rd time. This meant an increased and unrestricted flow of Asians into the country. A period of turmoil was also the opportune time for great armed invasions. Among these invaders were the Hyksos, the children of Israel, according to the historian Josephus. This invasion of Egypt in 1720 BC was ruthless and aimed at nothing less than the extermination of the Egyptian people and their replacement by the Israelites. They did not succeed in this, but settled down to rule the country as the 13th and 16th dynasties and stayed as a powerful influence for over 400 years. Note, some writers say that they were Arabs and that their rule lasted about 250 years. End of note. The important point here is that Semites poured into Egypt following its conquest by fellow tribesmen, and that this still further advanced the Asiatic character of the Egyptians. Hyksos' power was broken during the 18th dynasty, and many were expelled en masse. They returned to Palestine and founded Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Egypt was developing into the new empire, and during the same dynasty in which the Hyksos had been expelled, she struck back by conquering the Hyksos homeland and Syria and extended conquest to the Euphrates. it should be noted that the greatest Hebrew invasion of Egypt occurred about 600 years before Moses and the captivity. One reason why the great issues in African history must be both reviewed and expanded is that anyone who dares to challenge the prevailing and widely held viewpoints is in a position far more precarious than that of little David facing the towering and mightily armed Goliath. Here, an almost universal army of giants, standing steadfastly in defense of the Africanist ideologies they have developed, must be combated. To this end, I review positions already stated in order to be crystal clear, and I expand by introducing additional facts on the same subject. Indeed, I might be properly accused of overemphasizing one point on which most scholars are already agreed: the great antiquity of African civilization. But the greatest of all issues is right here in the general agreement that at the very earliest period known to mankind, an African civilization in the areas later called the Sudan and Egypt was fully developed, with all the arts of civilized life already matured, its beginning being placed so far into the early history of the world that it is beyond the reach of man. Since the most compelling evidence forced scholars to these conclusions in recent times, the prevailing racist theories of history created a very real dilemma. How, in view of civilization's beginning in the land of the blacks, to explain their role in world history? Having successfully degraded the black race throughout the world and supported that degradation with their science and religion, how now explain that this same black race was the first builders of the very civilization of which the Caucasians themselves are heirs? White scholarship solves such problems very neatly and without a blink of an eye. In this case, they very simply put the white man in Africa before the black man. And apparently not feeling secure enough with this, they overrode geography itself and took Egypt out of Africa, making it a part of the Asian Middle East. Laughter and tragedy. For, of course, a racism so extreme that it becomes ridiculous also becomes amusing, even though it is at the same time the tragedy of an unabated 20th century assault on the blacks. The discovery that the earliest civilization, and therefore the most advanced nation, were in Africa led white scholars to do a quick turnabout, going far beyond transforming the indigenous people into whites. They now made Africa the birthplace of the entire human race, and, to please God, rushed back to Noah's sons again for a theory of racial origins and dispersions, but now from Africa over the earth. Western scholars, in the absence of solid facts, do not hesitate to use myth and legend if these serve their purposes. So, in addition to the legend of how the different races came to be and migrated, we also have quoted the Egyptian legend of how the god Tum assigned colors to the various groups. Sir Gardner Wilkinson, in his 3 volumes on ancient Egypt, follows the same well-known line about Egyptians as Caucasians. In this, he is quite in step with most Western and Asian writers on the subject. Indeed, in addition to the evidence cited above, he relies also on Caucasian features in certain Egyptian monuments, portraits, etc. The head carvings, pictures, and other representations of people are quite true, depending on the period in which the work was done. Was it done during the long era of classical representations when all portraits were of a standardized form? The subject was idealized in an artistic attempt to make him look quite different than he actually was. In fact, a true representation of the individual was considered vulgar. The complementary question is, were the wall paintings and similar depictions done during the periods of Caucasian ascendancy, Asian and Afro-Asian? For during these periods, both African and Afro-Asian ruling and upper classes were classed as Asians or Caucasians, and a sharp distinction was made between themselves and the non-integrating blacks. The stylized paintings also show the blacks in the same unvarying patterns. The first known revolt against this ancient system of classical art came during Akhenaten's religious reforms in the 15th century BC. Note: Khafre actually broke the tradition in the 4th dynasty, but the Negroid features in the Sphinx did not change the classical style. End of note. Anyone examining these early paintings will readily see why African history is so confused and so often misleading. One example is a wall painting in a tomb at Thebes, the oldest city of the blacks. The picture shows Negroes presenting tribute to the chief minister of Thutmose III. If one did not know that all the Thutmoses were of an African lineage, he would naturally conclude that Egyptian civilization was in fact a Caucasian civilization, and the blacks, where they appear on the scene at all, were in a distinctively inferior role. Were not the paintings conclusive evidence of this? Look at their scanty, almost barbarous attire. The city of 100 gates. References have been made to Thebes, and it may have seemed to be almost passing references. Yet Thebes was the most important single city in the entire history of the black people. The whole series of lectures could be properly based on Thebes. The history of black Africa might well begin at Thebes, for this was truly the eternal city of the blacks that presented the most compelling evidence that they were the builders of the earliest civilization in Kem, later called Egypt, as well as the great civilization in the south. The foundation of Thebes, like the black state of which it was the center, goes so far back in prehistory that not even a general Stone Age period can be suggested. This city is another example of what was meant when I suggested earlier that research workers should not shun the enemy authorities because they themselves inevitably present factual data that contravene positions previously taken. I am not speaking about those scholars who present the various conflicting theories and viewpoints of the different schools of thought. It should be needless to say that this is desirable, or that reference is not made to such writers, but reference was made to those historians who espoused such doctrines as that of an indigenous white African society before the arrival of the blacks in Africa, and then later on themselves unwittingly showing that such could not have been the case. So almost all are forced by the evidence to concede in one place or another, and often in very guarded or ambiguous language, that 1. The blacks were also called Thebians because 2. All Upper Egypt was for centuries called the Thebaid after its greatest city Thebes and its people, the black Thebans. 3. That the Thebaid also referred to the city itself as the intellectual center of black Africa, the chief seat of learning, of science, religion, engineering, and the arts. Theobald, therefore, could mean the whole of black Egypt or the university city, depending on the inflection of the voice. 4. That the Asian whites were held rather firmly in the Delta region they occupied in Lower Egypt until the unification of the two lands under Menes. 5. And that the much heralded Egyptian dynasties were African founded and were nothing more nor less than the African traditional lineage system, matrilineal in character except when it was made patrilineal after Asian conquest or the great Egyptian transformation. I have said that the confusion in African history did not develop accidentally or because of a long series of unfortunate circumstances. The confusion seems to have been deliberately contrived. All specialists on ancient Egypt whose works we have examined were quite familiar with all the facts presented here. I present nothing here that would be new to them, for so much of it is their own findings. Consider how much confusion and misinterpretations would have been avoided if they had stated the well-established fact that the Ethiopian Empire still included most of Egypt, even after the Asian occupation of the Delta, that it extended southward over northern Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia, and that states such as Wawet, Nubia, Kush, etc. were, like Egypt, lesser divisions of that vast empire. Even in the works, where this is presented in various and sundry ways, you will not find a single map showing the extent of the Ethiopian Empire. To present maps of ancient Ethiopia, of course, would have defeated all major efforts to destroy or disguise the most significant aspects of African history. All honors must go to the ancient Greek and Roman historians who did not seem to know what racism is. Certainly not as it developed in modern white civilization. They, in dealing with Africa, simply told it like it was. Pliny, Herodotus, Diodorus, Eratosthenes, Plutarch et al., along with the Bible, all refute the interpretations of African history by modern Caucasians. They eagerly quote the ancient historians as first-line authorities, but attack them whenever and wherever their records upset the premises upon which modern racism is built. In such cases, the Western scholar feels so absolute and infallible in his wealth-centered power and control over science and education that on those points he does not choose to accept, he will dismiss the father of history with, "Here Herodotus must be read with caution. He is known to have made errors. He did not travel very much in Africa," or "It is very likely that Diodorus was relying on oral tradition here," or "They may have confused the Greek Ethiopia, which means the black land, with Kem, Egypt, which also means the black land." For Pliny suggests that in the case of Egypt, black refers to the soil rather than the people, and so it goes. Throughout the study of the black man's history, we may find ourselves constantly misled or puzzled if we forget that practically all the names and terms in use are not African names and terms, but Greek, Roman, Arabic, Anglo-Saxon, etc. Some of the more recent pre-European and pre-Asian African names, however, have been rediscovered. One of these earlier names for Thebes was the No, the Na-Amun of the Bible and ancient Hebrew writers. But the African name was Waose, and, like the Greek Theobald, referred to all Upper Ethiopia or Upper Egypt. The blacks also made the distinction between Waose, the Theobald, and Noe, Thebes. the university city. Another point of the highest importance here is that the African name for Thebes not only comes from the south, as Nims points out, but the name itself is the name of the imperial scepter of Ethiopia, a golden staff ribboned with ostrich feathers at the top. Here now is a single name that, all by itself alone, gives far-reaching insights into the history of the blacks. And this is why I have urged that high up on the list of research fields yet to be explored, there should be one devoted to the rediscovery of African names and their meaning. For, obviously, much of the African past was rather effectively blotted out by blotting out African names along with other indexes to black achievements. The determination of ancient African names and their meaning will spearhead a real black revolution because it will lead directly to the emancipation of our still enslaved minds. It will be the great intellectual reawakening of a people whose world outlook through Caucasian eyes has been dimmed. I cannot now, for example, switch to the use of the African names I know in this discussion. I must continue to say Thebes, not Woose or No Way. The reasons are obvious, but if the kind of suggested research is done, the next generation of black writers will be using African terms freely and understandably, and with maps redrawn showing places with their own original names. But let us never forget the central fact about Thebes, not even for a moment. For if the blacks had never left a single written record of their past greatness, that record will still stand, defying time, in the deathless stones of Thebes, of her fallen columns from temples, monuments, and her pyramids. A city more eternal than Rome because its foundation was laid before the dawn of history, and its plan was that copied by other cities of the world. If the blacks of today want to measure the distance to the heights from which they have fallen, they need go no further than Norway, Thebes. Thebes and the role of religion. The mother of cities, as it was called, was one of the chief centers of religion in Africa. The blacks were a very religious people and had quite a number of religious cities, each one under the special patronage of a god, goddess, or any number of deities. The gods and goddesses of Thebes were among the most important because their city was so important. Because religion to the Africans was far more than ritual reflecting beliefs, but a reality reflected in their actual way of life. Religion from the earliest times became the dynamic force in the development of all the major aspects of black civilization. The belief in immortality was a simple matter, of course, and beyond the realm of debate. This belief in life after death was the great inspiration for building on so grand a scale, trying to erect structures that will stand forever. Necessity, therefore, gave birth to the mathematical sciences required for building the amazing pyramids and the architectural designs for the most elaborate system of temple building the world had ever known. As the city of Amun, the king of the gods, and of his wife, the great goddess Mut, the temples and monuments to them alone had to be on a massive scale. There was also the war god of Thebes, the source of the power of the mightiest armies, the proudest and most fearless warriors. From this center of empire alone, 20,000 war chariots could be put into the field. The hierarchy of deities not only included numerous lesser gods and goddesses, but also a long line of venerated former kings, queens, and ancestors. All of this not only inspired endless temple building at Thebes, but also a concentration on attaining the highest standards of excellence. This in turn called for reflective thinking, invention, and discovery. Many of the temples were what we call colleges, as the different fields of study were temple-centered. Here, scholars from foreign lands came to study, and from here religious ideas and architectural designs spread abroad. The early Greeks and Romans eagerly copied from both, reshaped them, and made them integral parts of an original Western culture. During periods of decline or conquest, Europe and Asia seized and transported from Africa as much of the artifacts of its civilization as they could. Cambyses, for example, as early as the 6th century BC, hauled away over $100 million worth of precious historical materials from Thebes alone. Cambyses was only one of countless thousands who invaded the tomb repositories of black history during each of the many periods of foreign invasions and foreign rule. For these tombs not only contained valuable historical records in different forms, but also great treasures in gold and precious stones. In these cases, the historical records were generally destroyed incidentally and not deliberately. The raid on graves and the great tombs were for the great treasures to be found there. But the stolen gold and other treasures were of no importance when compared with the mass of priceless historical materials that are scattered over Europe and Asia, some in museums, some destroyed or thrown away, all from the heartland of black civilization. Today, the descendants of the robbers still smugly declare, the blacks never had any worthwhile history. If so, where are their records? The still interesting fact about Thebes is that many of its formerly great temples were prehistoric ruins even 5,000 years ago. The most ancient temple at Karnak, for example, in what was the center of Norway, goes back beyond the reach of man's records. No other city on earth ever had so many temples, and even today there are more ruins of temples there than anywhere in the world. Because of the splendor of their architectural designs and the colossal size of the structures, they, like the pyramids, became wonders of the world. Religion was not only the immediate occasion for the development of art and architecture, but it also inspired the drive for bigness, the grand design, on a scale as huge as human skill and effort could achieve. Nothing less was befitting the gods. The keepers of the temples of Thebes and elsewhere became a powerful priesthood, thus indirectly reducing the power and influence of chiefs and kings who, in traditional Africa, derived their real powers as the official intermediaries between the gods, sainted ancestors, and the people. If an African king or chief had any real political power, it was acquired either by virtue of his religious functions or because of the prestige of being a great general and victorious warrior. Otherwise, the council was the constitutional center of power. Moreover, religion became the basis of political power in a subtle and more far-reaching sense. For back behind the impenetrable curtains of time, shrewd leaders saw the overriding mystery of religion as a controlling force in the lives of men. It appears that in almost all societies, religion was recognized not only as the principal means of social control, but the equally certain source of economic wealth and political authority. From the chieftain's role of offering prayers and sacrifices to the gods, the steps to his own claim of kinship with the deities were easy enough. For who can gainsay one who is in exclusive communication with the Almighty? Although divine kinship was never widespread over the continent, it seems to be true that the ideas and practices of the divine despots of the Orient did penetrate and influence a number of African kingdoms. The point of all this is that religion made the people submissive, obedient, and all the more so if their ruler had a superhuman role and even kinship with the gods and the protecting ancestors. For did this not mean then that rulers held all the keys to heaven? Indeed, the chiefs and kings had evolved into the very instruments of the people's salvation. The state's income from religion stemmed from the requirement of sacrificial offerings from the people. This might be from 10 to 50% of what each individual produced or earned. But where the traditional constitutional law of the blacks prevailed, the people contributed of their means willingly for a quite non-religious reason. The central treasury belonged to the people and was maintained for people's welfare, and not only for public projects, but for the relief of each and every individual in distress whose needs could not be met by his family or clan. However, African constitutional law received its first blows in Egypt in the wake of numerous invasions and foreign rule, followed later by its almost complete destruction by Muslim and European conquest. The ancient religion that gave birth to science and learning, art, engineering, architecture, the resources for a national economy and political control, that same religion was the mother of history, of writing, of music, the healing art, the song, and the dance. The first historians were the professional storytellers and traveling singers. Both recounted the deeds of leaders, important events such as wars and migrations, and how and by whom the society or state was founded. Poetry and music were the creations of the people in general, and, like the dance, came so easily that they seemed to be the natural heritage of everyone. The dance also recorded a message, just as the various musical instruments and singing tell a story, appealed for spiritual aid from God and ancestors, expressed joy for successful harvest, hunting, victories in war, or forms of prayer to ward off the evil spirits that always seek to overcome the good. Sickness is one of these evils, hence the association of medicine with the spiritual forces for good. The ritual for appealing to a power beyond man is called magic by Westerners, that is, if they are discussing Africa. Exactly the same belief and practice are called divine healing in Christendom. The great civilization of the blacks that for countless ages was centered around Noe, Thebes, did not just happen. Progress does not happen automatically. Every forward step made by these early blacks was made, you might even say forced, by the imperatives of what had to be done to survive. Bear in mind that spiritual survival was much more important than physical, a concept the modern world is not expected to understand at all. The development of writing is not explained by the simple statement of a need to communicate. The idea of permanence seemed to motivate the drawing of pictures and symbols, which were man's first step toward the art of writing. Significantly, the scribes arose in the holy temples, and this is why so many inscriptions of historical importance have been found there, on walls, altars, and on colonnades. The world's oldest city, that not only had the greatest number of temples, but also the oldest, must have been the place where the largest mass of historical data would have been found, if the plunderers from different countries had not destroyed, stolen, and carried away so much of it. Here we need not be as much concerned with further testimony such as that of Diodorus affirming that the Thebans were the oldest, first, men on earth, according to their tradition, and that they also originated the systems of philosophy and astrology. We need not be as much concerned about their antiquity, which is already well established, as we are about the loss of so much of the additional evidence concerning the development of philosophy and the beginning of the space science of astrology. Ancient Greek scholars, through Herodotus, refer to the completion of their education in Ethiopia with pride, and it appears as a matter of course. So much has been built up against the black race since those faraway times that it will be difficult for many people of today to realize that whites of the ancient world did not seem to regard the question of Ethiopia as the principal center of learning as even debatable. But we have to remind ourselves constantly, racism as we know it today was practically non-existent. When an ancient people boasted of their superiority over another nationality group, the terms of reference were conquest, political rule, and some kind of myth to legitimize that rule. When the fortunes of war enabled one white nation to enslave the entire population of another white state, no one believed that the conquered people were actually, that is, innately inferior to the conquerors. Neither did the relatively backward Asian whites who invaded Egypt consider themselves superior to the black builders of the civilization they found there. The emphasis has been on the Thebaid as all Upper Egypt as Upper Ethiopia, and Thebes, Norway, as its most ancient city, and one of the very earliest centers of black civilization. And we have said that the ancient whites so regarded it. The Greek historian Eratosthenes refers to Menes as the Theban and first king of Thebes, meaning the Thebaid or Upper Egypt when it was united with Lower Egypt, and the beginning of the first dynasty, 3100 BC. The same historian noted that Menes' reign of 62 years was one of the longest in history, and that of his nephew Eratosthenes ran a close second, 59 years. During this early period, and before Memphis was founded, the city of 100 gates spread 6 square miles over both sides of the Nile. It was also the City Beautiful, being called by more different glorifying names than any city known to the ancient world. Its widest avenues, lined with sphinxes, temples, palaces, and monuments, could accommodate the array of colorful chariots, 20 abreast. It was also the two cities, or the city of the living and the city of the dead. One was on the east side of the river, and the other was on the west side. Each vied with the other in a race for magnificence. Palaces and mansions were largely concentrated on the east bank. Temples, being everywhere, were about as numerous in the city of the living as in the city of the dead, on the west bank, where the mortuary temples of kings and queens were located, along with the various religious cults and houses of priests, craftsmen, soldiers, and the masses. The West Bank was such a beehive of industrial, commercial, and religious activities that City of the Dead, even though it refers to its famous burial places, is nevertheless a very misleading name. Thebes' status as the capital city and center of imperial activities rose and declined, with few exceptions, according to the race or nationality of the ruling dynasty at that time. Being the center of black power, it was a main object for destruction by non-African invaders, and after they had achieved control, they established new capitals elsewhere. The importance of the city that had been the envy of the world was ignored, and many of its cultural activities were transferred elsewhere. No white pharaoh could feel either comfortable or safe in the center of one of the most heavily populated areas of blacks in the empire. The colored Egyptians generally felt the same way. Thebes was also eclipsed at times by the building programs of black kings in their drive to advance from the very old to the very new, and also for the purpose of securing a more effective centralized administration. The building of Memphis was for this purpose. On the other hand, Pianki and his successors in the 25th dynasty apparently preferred the capital city of Napata in the deep south over both Thebes and Memphis. Was this because the holy city of Napata was like Meroe, the one great all-black city that had never been defiled by the conqueror's hands? We may so speculate. It is clear, however, that Thebes reflected the shifts in power more directly, whether or not the shifts were occasioned by internal or external forces. It declined as Memphis rose during the dynasties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 3100 to 2345 BC. These were the first 5 African lineages to rule after the reunification. There was a further decline of Thebes after the 5th dynasty, and again for internal reasons of a quite different nature. Suffice it to say that after the period during which there was an active policy of integrating Africans and Asians through the Memphis capital on their dividing line, the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, native kings generally sought to restore to its ancient glory the city so dear to the hearts of the blacks.